It started in March 2020, during the peak of the pandemic when the world was thrown into chaos. Jenna, a 24-year-old graphic designer, had just moved to a new city in California for a remote job. The apartment was small but cozy, perfect for a fresh start. However, moving in during a lockdown wasn't ideal. She didn't have the chance to meet her neighbors or explore the area, and the isolation began to wear on her. Jenna had a roommate, Lisa, whom she had found through an online ad. Lisa seemed nice enough, quiet, reserved, and always kept to herself. They barely interacted, as Lisa worked nights at a hospital and spent most of her time locked in her room. Jenna didn't mind. She liked her privacy. But then, strange things started happening. One evening, Jenna made spaghetti for two. She thought it might be nice to bond with Lisa, especially since the isolation was making her feel lonely. She knocked on Lisa's door and called out, "Dinner's ready." There was no response. She assumed Lisa was asleep or out working, so she left a plate on the counter and went to bed. The next morning, Jenna noticed the plate of spaghetti was untouched, but the fork had been moved. Odd, she thought, but maybe Lisa wasn't hungry. A week later, Jenna started hearing faint noises at night, whispers, almost like someone was talking just outside her bedroom door. At first, she thought it was Lisa on the phone, but the whispers never stopped, even when Lisa wasn't home. One night she pressed her ear against the wall separating her room from Lisa's. The whispers grew louder, but she couldn't make out the words. They were muffled, like a chant or a prayer. It gave her chills. Maybe it's the stress of the lockdown, Jenna told herself. I'm just imagining things. But the whispers didn't stop. Jenna grew curious about Lisa. She realized she didn't know much about her roommate. Lisa rarely came out of her room, and when she did, it was only to grab a drink or use the bathroom. Jenna hadn't even seen Lisa eat a single meal in weeks. One day, Jenna noticed Lisa's bedroom door was slightly ajar. The curiosity got the better of her, and she peeked inside. The room was empty. Not just empty, completely bare. No furniture, no clothes, nothing. It looked like no one had ever lived there. Jenna's heart pounded. She stumbled back into the hallway, her mind racing. Had Lisa moved out without telling her? But she could still hear footsteps late at night, and her rent was being paid on time. Determined to figure out what was going on, Jenna decided to do some digging. She called the landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Grayson, and asked about Lisa. "Lisa?" Mr. Grayson sounded confused. "There's no Lisa on the lease. You're the only tenant in that unit." Jenna felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. "No, that's impossible. She moved in with me last month. I found her through an ad." There was a long pause. "Miss, that apartment has been a single lease for years. The last tenant before you? Well, let's just say she left suddenly." "What do you mean?" Jenna pressed. "She was found dead in her room," Mr. Grayson said quietly. She had been living alone. Terrified, Jenna decided to leave the apartment. She packed a suitcase and booked a hotel for the next day. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard the whispers again, louder this time, and coming from right outside her door. Her breath caught as the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Lisa, or what looked like Lisa. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken, and her lips curled into a sinister smile. "You're leaving already?" Lisa whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. "I thought we were just starting to get along," Jenna screamed and bolted out of the apartment, leaving everything behind. Jenna never returned to that apartment. She later learned that Lisa had been the previous tenant who died during the lockdown, a death ruled as natural causes. But Jenna knew better. Whatever Lisa had become, she was still there, and she wasn't leaving. The pandemic had swept across the world with terrifying speed, locking down entire cities and leaving people stranded in their homes. No one expected it to last this long. For Olivia, it was a slow suffocation. She had lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment in the heart of the city. Once, the streets outside her window had been bustling with people, cars, and the hum of urban life. Now, all that remained was an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional car passing by and the distant wail of an ambulance siren. Her job, like so many others, had been moved online, which meant her days became a blur of endless Zoom meetings, work calls, and the monotonous hum of her computer screen. At first, she tried to keep busy, filling her time with projects, reading, and the occasional online workout. But as the days stretched into weeks, the walls of her apartment started closing in. And then, it started. It was late one evening when Olivia first heard the knocking. At first, it was so faint she thought she was imagining it, a soft rapping against her door. But then, it came again. 3 knocks, rapid but rhythmic. Olivia frowned and checked the time. It was just after midnight, and she hadn't expected anyone. She hesitated, peering through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. Her apartment building was quiet. Too quiet. There was no one there. Maybe it was just a prank. Olivia shrugged it off and returned to her laptop, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The knocking had been too precise, too deliberate. She tried to focus on her work, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. The next night, the knocking came again. Same time, same rhythm, 3 knocks. This time, Olivia didn't waste any time peeking through the peephole. She stood frozen, staring at the door. This couldn't be real. She lived on the top floor of the building, so the idea of someone knocking on her door at such a late hour seemed absurd. There were only a few other apartments on her floor, and she knew her neighbors well enough to know they wouldn't be playing pranks. Olivia's curiosity won over her fear, and she opened the door. Nothing. The hallway was empty once more. At first, she laughed it off, chalking it up to the stress of being isolated for so long. But as the knocking continued each night, Olivia's sense of unease began to grow. It was always the same, 3 knocks, then silence. No one ever stood outside her door. No one ever spoke. It was as if someone was standing there, waiting for her to answer, only to disappear as soon as she opened the door. By the 3rd week of isolation, the knocking had escalated. Olivia had begun recording the sounds on her phone, hoping to prove to herself that she wasn't imagining things. But one night, something was different. The knocks were still there, but this time, after the 3rd tap, Olivia heard something else. An unmistakable voice. "Let me in," it whispered. The voice was soft, almost a sigh, but it was distinct. Her heart raced, and she felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. "Let me in," it repeated, this time louder. Olivia stumbled back from the door, her hand trembling as she fumbled for her phone. She quickly checked her apartment building's security cameras. There was no one in the hallway, no figure standing outside her door. Was she losing her mind? She texted her closest friend, Rachel, about the strange happenings. But when Rachel replied, she was more concerned about the lockdown than about Olivia's fears. Olivia dismissed it, deciding that maybe Rachel was right. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But the next night, the knocks came again. And this time, they were louder, more insistent. Olivia couldn't ignore them any longer. As the days wore on, Olivia became more and more fixated on the knocks. She couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on her work. It was as though something was pulling her attention away, keeping her on edge. One night, she decided to get to the bottom of it. She left her apartment, determined to catch whoever was behind the noise. She crept down the hallway, glancing nervously over her shoulder, half expecting someone to jump out at her. The building was dark, and the silence was almost suffocating. The dim, flickering lights cast long shadows on the walls, and the air felt thick with tension. She walked slowly, every creak of the floorboards echoing in the empty space. As she neared the end of the hallway, she saw something strange. There, at the very end of the hall, was a door she had never noticed before. It was a small door, almost hidden behind a thick curtain, as though it had been deliberately concealed. Olivia's pulse quickened. She hadn't seen this door in the building before. Was it always there? The curiosity was too much to ignore. She moved toward it, her footsteps cautious. When she reached the door, she noticed that it was slightly ajar. Without thinking, she pushed it open. The room beyond was small, dimly lit, and filled with old furniture, an old chair, a dusty desk, and a stack of papers. But what caught Olivia's attention was the small notebook lying on the desk. She walked toward it, her breath shallow. As she opened the book, she saw that the pages were filled with handwritten notes, scattered thoughts, fragments of sentences. The first page read, Day 1. The knocking has begun again. I'm not sure how long I can take it. Olivia's heart pounded as she flipped through the pages, each one more disturbing than the last. The entries spoke of a person trapped in isolation, driven to madness by the relentless knocking. Her hands shook as she turned to the final entry, the last words written before the page ended in frantic scribbles. Let me in. I can't take it anymore. They're watching me. They're here. Suddenly, the building shook. Olivia gasped, dropping the notebook. Her heart raced as she turned to the door. The knocks were back, this time louder than ever. Knock, knock, knock. She ran back to her apartment, her mind racing. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, trying to steady her breathing. But the knocks didn't stop. They grew louder, more frantic, more desperate. She sank to the floor, clutching her knees to her chest. Her entire body was shaking. She had to get out of there. But when she opened the door, there was no hallway. There was only darkness. It started as a getaway, a chance to escape the suffocating monotony of lockdown life. When Sarah, a 35-year-old freelance graphic designer, got the email from her childhood friend Mark about renting a cabin deep in the Appalachian woods, it sounded like the perfect idea. Mark assured her it was secluded, quiet, and had everything they needed to unwind. Think of it as a creative retreat, he'd said. The idea of spending a few weeks surrounded by nature, with no news updates or Zoom calls, was tempting. So, Sarah packed her car and drove 5 hours to meet Mark and his girlfriend Rachel at the cabin. It was the last time she'd ever feel safe. The cabin was smaller than Sarah had imagined. It sat on a clearing, surrounded by dense, towering trees. The wood was weathered and gray, and the windows were covered in thick, faded curtains. Cozy, right? Mark grinned as he unlocked the door. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit and smelled faintly of mildew. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and the electricity was powered by an old generator that sputtered noisily in the evenings. Sarah felt a pang of unease but pushed it aside. Just 3 weeks, she told herself. The first few nights were uneventful. They spent their days hiking and their evenings playing cards by the fireplace. But on the fourth night, Sarah woke up to the sound of footsteps outside her window. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The cabin was so remote that the idea of anyone being out there was unsettling. Peeking through the curtains, she saw nothing but darkness. The next morning, she mentioned it to Mark and Rachel. Probably an animal, Mark said, shrugging. But Rachel looked uneasy. I thought I heard something last night too, like whispering. Mark laughed it off, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. On the fifth day, Sarah stumbled upon a door in the hallway that she hadn't noticed before. It was locked. Hey, what's in here? She asked Mark. Mark frowned. I don't know. The guy who owns the place didn't mention it. Probably just storage. But that night, as the generator hummed loudly, Sarah swore she heard a faint noise coming from behind the locked door. Later that week, Sarah decided to take a solo hike to clear her head. She followed a narrow trail that wound through the trees until she came across something unexpected. A man. He was standing in the middle of the trail, staring at her. He was tall and thin, with unkempt hair and clothes that looked decades old. Are you lost? Sarah asked, her voice shaky. The man didn't respond. He just tilted his head and smiled, a wide, unsettling grin that made her blood run cold. She turned and ran back to the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest. Did you see anyone out there? Rachel asked when Sarah burst inside. Sarah nodded, breathless. A man. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. Mark's face darkened. We need to keep the doors locked. That night, Sarah woke to a sound that made her skin crawl, scratching. It was coming from the locked room. She nudged Rachel awake, and the two of them crept into the hallway. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. We have to open it, Rachel whispered. Mark joined them, holding a crowbar. With a deep breath, he pried the door open. Inside, they found an empty room, except for a single wooden chair in the center. The walls were covered in deep, jagged scratches, as if something, or someone, had been clawing to get out. A chill ran through the room, and the three of them backed away, slamming the door shut. The next morning, Rachel was gone. Her shoes were still by the door and her jacket hung on the hook, but there was no sign of her. They searched the woods, shouting her name until their voices were hoarse, but the only thing they found was a broken bracelet lying near the edge of the forest. "She wouldn't just leave," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. Mark's expression was grim. "We need to leave. Now." That night, as they packed their bags, the cabin grew unnaturally cold. The fire in the hearth sputtered out and the generator died, plunging them into darkness. Then came the whispers. They started as faint murmurs, barely audible, but grew louder and closer, echoing through the cabin. "Who's there?" Mark shouted, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped, and then the door to the locked room creaked open. A figure stepped out of the room, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was Rachel, or at least it looked like her. Her eyes were empty, her skin pale, and her mouth twisted into that same unsettling grin Sarah had seen on the man in the woods. "Rachel?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Rachel tilted her head, her grin widening. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice distorted and hollow. Mark grabbed Sarah's arm, and they bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. "They're watching," Rachel hissed. "They never let anyone leave." In a desperate act, Mark smashed a window with a chair, and he and Sarah climbed through, cutting their hands on the broken glass. They ran into the woods, the whispers following them, growing louder with every step. They didn't stop until they reached the road and flagged down a passing car. When they returned with the police the next day, the cabin was empty. There was no sign of Rachel or the man Sarah had seen in the woods. But the locked room was different. Carved into the walls were the words, "You'll be back." Samantha had always considered herself a light sleeper. She could wake up at the slightest sound, whether it was the rustling of leaves outside her window or the soft thud of her neighbor's footsteps in the hallway. But there was something about her new apartment that kept her on edge. It wasn't that it was in a bad part of town. On the contrary, it was a quiet, well-kept building. The people around her seemed friendly enough. But something about the old building, the creaky floors, the musty smell in the air, the flickering lights, gave her a strange feeling that wouldn't go away. The building, at least, had a history. It was one of the few buildings in the city that had been standing for nearly a century, and the stories it could tell were far older than most. But it wasn't until the night she moved in that Samantha began to realize how much of the past still clung to the building, and how much it would come to haunt her. It all started with apartment B. Samantha's apartment was on the 3rd floor, and she had settled in quickly. The space was small but cozy, and the view from the window was lovely. A little garden at the back of the building. At first, everything seemed normal, except for one odd thing. The apartment next door to hers, apartment B, remained empty. The door to apartment B was always shut tight, and the hallway light outside it flickered sporadically. Samantha had never seen anyone come or go from that apartment. At first, she thought it was just another vacant unit, but after a few days, she started hearing things. It was a faint sound at first. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, but never quite right. The sound wasn't like someone walking in a hurry or pacing back and forth. It was slow, almost mechanical, like the sound of a weight dragging across the floor. Samantha tried to ignore it. Maybe it was the old plumbing or the building settling. There were plenty of noises in old apartments, after all. But the more she heard it, the more unsettling it became. And then came the knocks. It was a late Tuesday evening when Samantha first heard it. She had been sitting on her couch, watching TV, when she heard a soft knock coming from the wall shared with apartment B. It was quiet at first, a gentle tapping. She paused, confused. Another knock came, this one louder. Samantha stood up, walking toward the wall, her heart beginning to race. She pressed her ear to the cool plaster. Knock, knock, knock. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone trying to get her attention. The sound felt unnaturally close, as if whoever was knocking was standing right behind the wall. Samantha stepped back, her hands trembling. She had no idea what to make of it. Who could be in there? No one had ever come to the door to apartment B. The manager had told her it was vacant, so who or what was making the noise? The knocking continued for several minutes before abruptly stopping. She tried to shake it off. The next evening, the knocking started again. This time, Samantha stood by her door, staring through the peephole into the hallway. For some reason, she felt the urge to do so, like she had to check, to make sure she wasn't imagining things. She waited for the sound to come again. Knock, knock, knock. The tapping was louder this time, and there was something else, like a faint, indistinguishable whisper that seemed to accompany it. Samantha couldn't make out the words, but it was as though someone, or something, was trying to communicate. And then, to her horror, something moved in the hallway. She saw it through the peephole. A shadow, tall and slender. It stretched unnaturally across the floor. The figure moved slowly, with a strange, jerky motion, as if it were unsure of its own steps. It was heading straight for apartment B. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she watched the figure disappear behind the door to the empty apartment. Her mind raced. Was there someone in there? Was it a person or something else entirely? The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. Samantha could no longer ignore the fact that something was wrong with apartment B. The knocking, the strange figure in the hallway. It all felt too real. That night, she could hear the dragging sound again. It was louder than before, as if whatever was in apartment B was moving closer and closer to her. The creaking of old floorboards echoed through the walls, and the whispers, those whispers, were unmistakable now. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to know what was going on. She grabbed her phone and dialed the building manager. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was groggy, like he had just woken up. "There's something wrong with apartment B," Samantha said, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's someone or something there. I hear knocking and I saw a shadow in the hallway. Something's not right." There was a long pause before the manager spoke again. "Apartment B?" "Yes, the one next to mine." The manager's tone shifted. I don't know how to tell you this, but no one's supposed to be in there. That apartment hasn't been rented out in over a year." Samantha's mind raced. She had no idea what to make of it. But before she could say anything more, the line went dead. Samantha couldn't sleep that night. She kept hearing the scraping sound, the whispers, the knocks on the wall. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that figure in the hallway, moving closer and closer to her door. Finally, unable to take it any longer, Samantha decided to confront the source of the noise herself. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the hallway. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost suffocating. As she approached the door to apartment B, the unmistakable sound of footsteps came again. Slow, deliberate, like they were following her. The door to apartment B was slightly ajar. Samantha pushed it open. What she found inside was not what she expected. The apartment was dark, utterly dark, as if the lights had been turned off long ago. But in the corner of the room, there was something strange. A figure. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man. He was standing still, facing the corner of the room, as though he were frozen in place. His body was unnaturally stiff, his hands held out in front of him, palms open as if reaching for something. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer. But as she moved toward the figure, something shifted. His head slowly turned toward her, and his eyes. They were wide open, unblinking. His pupils were dark as night, like endless voids, and his mouth was stretched into a grotesque, empty grin. Before she could scream, the apartment door slammed shut behind her. The building manager found Samantha the next morning, slumped against the door to apartment B, eyes wide with terror. She was alive, but something had changed. Her mind was lost somewhere far away, and when she spoke, it was only to whisper one word over and over. Knock. The apartment remained locked, sealed away from the rest of the building. The figure in the corner, the whispers, the knocking. It was all a mystery that no one dared solve, and no one ever lived in apartment B again.